Nobody discovers this the way movies suggest they should, in a single cinematic moment of clarity. It arrives instead through repetition, through dating someone new, feeling a flicker of hope that this might finally work, and then noticing, quietly and with growing unease, that something essential simply isn't there. Then doing it again with someone else, and again, each time hitting the same, oddly specific wall, a feeling that refuses to arrive no matter how compatible the new person seems on paper, no matter how much effort gets poured into trying to manufacture it artificially. This is how an avoidant actually discovers that no one else feels the way one particular person did, not through a single epiphany, but through a slow, accumulating, increasingly undeniable pattern of comparison that eventually becomes impossible to explain away. What follows is an explanation of what that specific feeling actually consists of, why it turns out to be so difficult, and in some cases genuinely impossible, to recreate with someone new, and what this entire process of repeated, disappointing comparison reveals, and doesn't reveal, about the relationship that originally produced it. This isn't going to be a simple, flattering story about destiny or unique chemistry, because that story, however satisfying, would be incomplete and occasionally quite misleading. The full picture is more complicated and considerably more useful than the version usually told. Anyone listening who has wondered whether an avoidant ex-partner ever truly experienced something with them that couldn't simply be found again with someone else deserves an honest, careful examination of what that specific feeling actually is, psychologically speaking, rather than a comforting but vague assurance that love, once genuine, simply can't be replaced. It's worth naming, before going further, why this particular question deserves such careful, nuanced treatment, rather than a simple, reassuring answer offered without qualification. This question touches something people deeply want to believe about relationships generally, that genuine connection is somehow unique and irreplaceable, that what existed between two specific people couldn't simply be recreated with anyone else given enough time and effort. This desire for uniqueness is entirely understandable, and in some cases, as this exploration has already discussed, it's genuinely accurate. But providing a simple, uniformly reassuring answer, regardless of a relationship's actual character, would do a disservice to anyone whose specific situation actually calls for more careful, honest examination instead. To understand why this particular feeling proves so difficult to recreate, it helps to examine what it actually consists of, because it isn't primarily about compatibility in the sense most people usually mean: shared interests, similar values, comparable senses of humor. These things matter, certainly, but they aren't what produces the specific elusive quality being described throughout this exploration. That quality is considerably more specific and considerably more dependent on accumulated particular history than on any general set of compatible traits that could, in theory, exist between an avoidant and any number of different people. The feeling being described here is built primarily from earned familiarity, an accumulated history of countless small, particular moments, the exact way a specific person's laughter sounds, the precise rhythm of how they respond during a difficult conversation, the particular quality of silence that develops between two people once enough shared experience has taught both of them exactly how to occupy that silence comfortably together. None of this transfers to a new person, no matter how compatible that new person might be in every other measurable way, because none of it is actually about compatibility. It's about accumulated, specific history, built moment by moment over considerable time, in a way that simply cannot be replicated instantly with someone new, regardless of how promising that someone new initially seems. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture a favorite, well-worn piece of clothing, one that fits not simply because of its size or its style, but because of the particular way it's softened and shaped itself over years of wear to the specific contours of one particular body. A brand new piece of clothing, even one identical in size and style, simply doesn't fit the same way yet, no matter how objectively similar it is, because it hasn't yet accumulated the particular worn-in history that made the original feel so effortlessly comfortable. This isn't a flaw in the new item. It simply hasn't had the time or the specific accumulated wear required to develop that same particular fit. This is close to what happens when an avoidant attempts to recreate a specific relational feeling with someone new, discovering, often with genuine surprise, that the new connection, however promising, simply doesn't yet carry the same accumulated particular history that made the previous relationship feel the way it did. This distinction between general compatibility and specific accumulated history matters enormously for understanding why this particular realization tends to develop gradually through repeated comparison rather than arriving all at once. There's a deeper physiological grounding worth explaining here as well, because it helps clarify why this specific, accumulated familiarity operates so differently from general compatibility, rather than this distinction being simply a matter of sentiment or metaphor. Human nervous systems develop a considerable amount of what researchers describe as implicit, embodied memory through repeated interaction with a specific person. Patterns of co-regulation, patterns of anticipating and responding to another person's particular rhythms and cues that develop gradually through repetition and that exist largely outside conscious, deliberate awareness. This kind of embodied familiarity operates differently from conscious, explicit memory, and it can't simply be transferred or recreated quickly through willpower or through matching general compatibility with someone new. This explains why an avoidant might genuinely, consciously prefer someone new in certain respects, finding them more compatible in terms of values, interests, or general temperament, while simultaneously experiencing a persistent, hard-to-articulate sense that something essential still feels different or less complete. This isn't contradictory. It reflects the genuine separation between conscious, explicit compatibility, which can be assessed and matched relatively quickly, and implicit, embodied familiarity, which develops only through the accumulated, repeated experience of actually being with a specific person over considerable time. The new relationship may genuinely be healthier and more compatible in every explicit sense while still lacking this deeper, implicit quality, simply because it hasn't yet had the time to develop it. This grounding also helps explain why patience and continued time, rather than any specific technique or effort, represents the only genuine path toward developing this same kind of depth with someone new. Implicit, embodied familiarity cannot be rushed or manufactured through deliberate effort alone. It requires the same kind of accumulated, repeated experience that produced it in the first relationship, applied now to a new person over a comparable amount of time. This is precisely why so many attempts at quickly recreating a specific previous feeling with someone new tend to fail, not because the new person is somehow lacking, but because the specific quality being sought simply cannot develop on a timeline shorter than the one that originally produced it. Each new attempt at connection genuinely could, in theory, eventually develop this same kind of accumulated familiarity, given enough time and enough shared experience. What the avoidant is actually discovering through repeated disappointing comparison isn't necessarily that no one else could ever feel this way. It's that no one else currently does, because the specific, particular history required to produce that feeling hasn't yet had time to accumulate with anyone new. It's worth naming what this discovery process actually tends to look like as it unfolds across multiple attempts at new connection, because understanding its typical trajectory helps explain why it takes as long as it usually does to become genuinely undeniable. It helps to describe this specific, recurring disappointment in more concrete detail, because the abstract description of something feeling different can be difficult to picture without something more specific attached to it. This disappointment often shows up during quiet, ordinary moments, rather than during any particular conflict or obvious incompatibility. A comfortable silence with a new partner that somehow doesn't carry the same effortless quality it once did with someone else, requiring a kind of conscious effort to sustain rather than simply happening naturally. It often shows up too in how humour lands, jokes, and references that once produced instant, easy laughter, now requiring more explanation, more setup, landing with less immediate, effortless connection than they once did. It frequently shows up as well in moments of minor stress or minor conflict, noticing that a new partner's particular way of handling disagreement, however reasonable and however healthy in its own right, simply doesn't produce the same felt sense of being understood that a previous partner's particular approach once provided, not because the new approach is worse, but because it's unfamiliar. lacking the specific accumulated shorthand that develops between two people only through considerable shared history, navigating similar moments together before. And it often shows up in physical affection specifically, noticing that touch from someone new, however genuinely pleasant and however genuinely welcome, simply doesn't carry the same immediate wordless sense of coming home that touch from a specific previous partner once provided, a difference that's difficult to articulate clearly, but that registers consistently and repeatedly as a persistent, nagging sense of something being slightly unmistakably different. These specific, recurring forms of disappointment, taken individually, might each be dismissed easily as simple newness or simple unfamiliarity. It's their consistent, repeated appearance across multiple different attempts with multiple different people that eventually makes the underlying pattern considerably harder to explain away using this same reasonable dismissal. The earliest attempts at new connection following a significant relationship's ending often carry genuine hope and genuine effort. An avoidant approaching someone new with real intention to build something meaningful, sometimes even consciously trying to recreate specific qualities that characterize the previous relationship. This early hope tends to encounter its first disappointment relatively quickly, a vague, hard-to-articulate sense that something feels different, off, or simply less than what came before, even when the new person seems, by every objective measure, entirely compatible and entirely worthwhile. This early disappointment often gets attributed, reasonably enough, to simple newness, the assumption that any new relationship naturally lacks the depth and comfort of a longer, more established one, and that given enough time, this new connection will eventually develop its own comparable depth. This assumption isn't unreasonable, and it often motivates continued effort and continued patience during these early attempts. It's only through repetition, multiple attempts across multiple different people, each producing a similar, familiar disappointment, despite genuine effort and genuine time invested, that the pattern eventually becomes difficult to explain away, using this same reasonable assumption about simple newness. There's something worth naming here regarding what actually distinguishes a relationship where this comparison discomfort genuinely reflects something specific and significant about the previous connection, from one where it might instead reflect something considerably less flattering and considerably more worth examining honestly. This distinction matters enormously because the framework being described throughout this exploration, that no one else feels quite the same way, can be genuinely true and meaningful in some cases, while in others, it can actually reflect something closer to a pattern worth questioning rather than romanticizing. It's worth being direct about this because it would be dishonest and ultimately unhelpful to present this entire phenomenon as though it always confirms genuine, rare compatibility. Sometimes the specific feeling an avoidant is struggling to recreate isn't actually a marker of unusually deep, healthy connection at all. It's a marker of unusually intense nervous system activation, produced not by safety and genuine intimacy, but by inconsistency, uncertainty, and the specific kind of anxious anticipation that characterizes relationships built more on unpredictability than on genuine, earned security. This kind of intensity can feel, subjectively, remarkably similar to the deeper, more meaningful connection being described throughout most of this exploration, precisely because both experiences produce genuine, significant emotional and physiological activation. But their underlying sources are considerably different, and conflating them tends to produce a genuinely misleading, potentially harmful conclusion. This distinction deserves careful, honest examination, because it protects against romanticizing a pattern that might actually reflect something worth addressing, rather than something worth missing. A relationship where the specific, hard-to-recreate feeling stemmed primarily from genuine safety, genuine accumulated trust, and genuine earned familiarity represents something meaningfully different from a relationship where that same feeling stemmed primarily from cycles of uncertainty, intermittent reassurance, and the specific kind of heightened emotional intensity that inconsistency and unpredictability tend to produce, particularly in anyone whose own attachment history has made them especially susceptible to mistaking that particular intensity for deep, meaningful connection. It's worth naming a few markers that help distinguish between these two possibilities. because relying purely on the intensity of missing someone, without examining what actually produced that intensity, risks drawing exactly the wrong conclusion from this entire pattern of comparison. It helps to describe these distinguishing markers in more specific, concrete terms, because the difference between genuine, earned depth and trauma bond intensity can be difficult to assess accurately without something more precise to examine. One useful marker involves how conflict was typically resolved throughout the relationship's history, whether disagreements generally moved toward genuine resolution and renewed closeness, or whether they tended to produce prolonged periods of anxious uncertainty, followed by relief once contact and reassurance were finally restored. This second pattern, relief following anxious uncertainty, tends to produce a particularly intense, memorable kind of emotional experience, one that can easily be mistaken for deep connection, when it more accurately reflects a nervous system responding to the resolution of genuine, repeated distress, rather than to genuine, ongoing safety. Another useful marker involves how much of the relationship's emotional intensity depended on uncertainty about the other person's feelings or intentions, rather than on confident, settled knowledge of mutual care and investment. Relationships built more on genuine safety tend to produce their intensity through depth of shared experience and genuine intimacy, rather than through uncertainty about whether that intimacy would continue to be available. Relationships built more on inconsistency tend to produce their intensity precisely through this uncertainty, an intensity that can feel remarkably similar from the inside, but that stems from a considerably less healthy source. A further useful marker involves examining how the relationship felt during its calmest, most ordinary periods, rather than during its most intense highs or its most anxious lows. Genuine, earned depth tends to feel good even during unremarkable, quiet moments, a settled, comfortable ease that doesn't require crisis or reunion in order to feel significant. Relationships built more on inconsistency tend to feel considerably less remarkable during these same quiet periods, with most of the relationship's memorable intensity concentrated specifically around its more dramatic highs and lows, rather than distributed evenly across its ordinary, everyday texture. Applying these markers honestly to a specific past relationship offers a considerably more reliable way of determining which category that relationship actually falls into, rather than relying purely on how intensely its absence continues to be felt, since intensity of longing on its own doesn't actually distinguish between these two considerably different underlying sources. If the previous relationship was generally characterized by consistency, by clear communication, by a felt sense of safety and security throughout most of its duration, then the difficulty of recreating its specific feeling likely does reflect genuine, meaningful, accumulated history, worth taking seriously, as this exploration has been describing throughout. If, instead, the previous relationship was generally characterized by uncertainty, by cycles of withdrawal and pursuit, by a felt sense of having to work hard, continuously, simply to maintain the connection's basic stability, then the difficulty of recreating its specific feeling deserves a more skeptical, more critical examination, since it may reflect a kind of intensity built on precisely the instability that made the relationship difficult and unsustainable in the first place, rather than reflecting anything genuinely worth missing or recreating. This is worth sitting with directly, because it complicates what might otherwise be a simple, flattering narrative about unique, unreplaceable connection. It's worth naming why this complication matters enough to include, even though a simpler, more universally flattering narrative would likely be more immediately satisfying to hear. A narrative suggesting that every instance of this comparison difficulty automatically confirms rare, genuine love risks encouraging people to romanticize relationships that may have actually been unhealthy, mistaking anxious intensity for depth simply because that intensity felt significant and difficult to replicate elsewhere. Offering this more complicated, more honest picture instead serves genuine understanding considerably better, even when it requires additional nuance and additional self-examination that a simpler story would have avoided entirely. Sometimes an avoidant's inability to recreate a specific feeling with anyone new genuinely does confirm something significant and rare about the previous relationship. Other times, it reflects something closer to a pattern of seeking out familiar intensity, regardless of whether that intensity actually served either person's genuine well-being, a pattern worth interrupting rather than a pattern worth romanticizing as evidence of true, irreplaceable love. For anyone listening who recognizes their own previous relationship as falling more clearly into the first category, one characterized primarily by genuine safety and genuine earned consistency, there's something important worth offering here. If an avoidant partner is genuinely struggling to recreate the specific feeling that relationship produced, this struggle likely does reflect something real and significant about what was actually offered throughout that relationship, a rare combination of safety and depth that doesn't develop instantly or automatically with just anyone, regardless of how compatible they might otherwise seem. For anyone listening who recognizes their own previous relationship as falling more clearly into the second category, one characterized primarily by uncertainty, inconsistency, and hard-won, intermittent reassurance, there's something equally important worth offering, though it may be less immediately comforting to hear. An avoidant's inability to recreate that particular intensity with someone new doesn't necessarily confirm anything worth missing about what was actually offered. It may simply confirm that the specific heightened nervous system activation produced by chronic uncertainty is, unsurprisingly, difficult to replicate in a healthier, more secure relationship, precisely because healthier, more secure relationships generally don't produce that same kind of anxious, uncertain intensity in the first place. This isn't a loss worth grieving. It's actually one of the clearer signs available that a new, healthier pattern might genuinely be developing instead. There's something practical worth naming here for anyone applying this framework honestly to their own past relationship, because this kind of self-examination serves a purpose considerably more significant than simply satisfying curiosity about an avoidant ex-partner's internal experience. Examining honestly which category a specific past relationship actually falls into, genuine safety and earned depth, or intensity built primarily on inconsistency and uncertainty, offers valuable practical guidance for anyone's own future relationship choices, entirely independent of whatever an avoidant ex-partner eventually realizes or does with their own comparison process. If a past relationship genuinely falls into the first category, this recognition offers a useful, positive template, evidence of what genuine safety and depth actually felt like, worth seeking out again in future relationships, built through similarly patient, consistent effort, rather than assumed to arrive quickly or automatically. If a past relationship falls more clearly into the second category, this recognition offers something equally valuable, though perhaps less immediately comfortable. A clearer understanding of a pattern worth actively avoiding in future relationships, recognizing intensity built on uncertainty and inconsistency for what it actually is, rather than mistaking it for depth or connection worth pursuing again. This kind of honest self-examination matters considerably more, in the end, than any specific conclusion about what a particular avoidant ex-partner is currently experiencing or eventually realizing through their own process of comparison. It offers direct, practical value for one's own future, regardless of anything happening in someone else's internal world, entirely separate from one's own ongoing life and ongoing choices. It's worth exploring further what actually happens once this pattern of repeated, disappointing comparison becomes genuinely undeniable to the avoidant experiencing it, because the response to this realization varies considerably and doesn't automatically produce any single, predictable outcome. For some avoidants, this realization produces a genuine reckoning with the significance of what was lost, sometimes prompting real, sustained effort to reconnect, sometimes simply producing a quiet, private grief that never gets communicated directly to the person who originally inspired it. For others, this same realization produces something closer to resignation, a decision to simply accept a less intense, less specifically matched connection with someone new, rather than continuing to search for something that repeated experience has suggested may not be findable again, at least not without the accumulated time and history that made the original relationship feel the way it did. There's no reliable way to predict, from the outside, which response a particular avoidant will ultimately move toward, and it's worth being honest that this uncertainty doesn't resolve simply because this specific pattern of comparison has become clear and undeniable to them. Recognizing that no one else currently feels the same way doesn't automatically produce any particular action, doesn't guarantee any specific attempt at reconnection, and doesn't obligate the avoidant experiencing this realization to do anything at all beyond simply, privately, sitting with an uncomfortable, difficult truth about what they've lost. There's something important worth naming here for anyone listening who might be hoping that this exploration offers some kind of reassurance that an avoidant ex-partner's eventual realization will necessarily lead back toward reconciliation. It doesn't offer that reassurance, because that outcome simply isn't reliable or predictable based on this pattern alone. What this exploration does offer is something more modest, but still genuinely valuable. An accurate, honest understanding of what this specific realization actually represents and what it doesn't, regardless of whether it ever produces any visible external consequence. It's worth addressing directly something that deserves careful, honest attention, because everything explored throughout this piece could easily be misapplied if taken as encouragement to wait indefinitely, hoping that an avoidant partner's eventual realization of this pattern will necessarily prompt them back toward reconciliation. This would be a significant misapplication of everything being explored here. This realization, however genuine and however significant, doesn't obligate any particular response. And building a life around waiting to discover whether it eventually produces one tends to serve one's own well-being considerably less than building a full, independent life that doesn't depend on that discovery or its consequences at all. There's something worth turning toward now that centers entirely on the person who created this specific, hard-to-recreate feeling in the first place, rather than on the avoidant currently struggling to find it again elsewhere, because everything explored throughout this piece has necessarily focused on decoding that avoidant's internal experience of comparison and realization, and that focus, however clarifying, shouldn't overshadow what this entire pattern actually reveals about the person capable of creating something this specific and this significant in the first place. If the relationship that produced this hard-to-recreate feeling was genuinely characterized by safety, consistency, and earned trust, then creating that feeling required real sustained effort and real genuine presence, offered over considerable time in a way that reflects genuinely significant relational capability. This capability doesn't disappear once a particular relationship ends. It remains fully available, capable of producing this same kind of depth and specificity again with someone new, given enough time and enough genuine mutual investment to develop that same kind of accumulated history once more. It's worth naming what this capability actually consists of, because it's easy to underestimate its significance, simply because it operated so quietly and so gradually throughout the relationship's entire duration, never announcing itself as anything particularly remarkable while it was actually happening. This capability includes a genuine willingness to remain consistently present across ordinary, unremarkable stretches of time, patience with gradual, accumulated trust building rather than expecting instant depth, and an ongoing attentiveness to another person's particular rhythms and needs, refined and adjusted continuously over considerable shared history. These qualities, taken together, represent genuine relational skill, considerably more significant and considerably more valuable than the more commonly discussed traits like charm or immediate chemistry, precisely because they're what actually produces lasting depth rather than simply initial attraction.